My name is Arthur Vance, and for 68 years, I believed that if you built something strong enough, it would weather any storm. I spent my life as a civil engineer, calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel and the endurance of concrete, making sure the bridges people crossed every day wouldn't collapse beneath them. I applied that same logic to my home. I thought that by being the steady foundation, the structure of my family would remain unshakable. But the thing about foundations is that you rarely see the cracks until the entire house starts to lean. 4 years ago, the leaning became a collapse. My wife, Eleanor, and my son, Julian, walked out of this house in Greenwich, not with tears or apologies, but with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. They left me in a house that cost $3 million, filled with furniture they chose, and memories I apparently hallucinated. For 4 years, I haven't heard a single word. No birthday cards, no holiday greetings, not even a text to see if I was still breathing after my heart surgery. I've lived in this echoing silence, watching the sunset over the garden I tended alone, realizing that to them I wasn't a husband or a father. I was just the man who signed the checks. Before we proceed deeper into the mystery of this old leather briefcase, after you have liked and commented to support Arthur's spirit, I would like to send my best wishes for health to all of you. I don't know where you are all listening to this story from, how old you are, or what time your clock is showing right now. I truly love reading those shares from you. Let's continue. It was a Tuesday, the kind of afternoon where the light turns a hazy, honeyed gold, and the shadows of the oak trees stretch long across the driveway. I was in the kitchen, carefully measuring out coffee grounds, a ritual of precision that has become my only companion. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Then, I heard it, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It wasn't the mail truck or a delivery. It was the heavy, deliberate purr of a high-end European engine. I didn't move at first. I stood with the scoop in my hand, listening. 2 car doors slammed. Footsteps followed the sharp, impatient click of heels and the heavier, dragging stride of a younger man. I knew those sounds. I hadn't heard them in 48 months, but they were etched into my central nervous system. When the doorbell rang, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like an overdue debt finally arriving at my door. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a slow breath to steady the thrumming in my chest, and walked to the foyer. When I opened the heavy mahogany door, the air felt colder. There stood Eleanor, looking exactly as she did the day she left, perhaps even more polished. Her hair was a perfect platinum bob, her cream-colored wool coat draped over her shoulders like a queen's mantle. Beside her was Julian, my son. He was 32 now, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, his eyes darting around the entryway, as if he were already mentally reappraising the artwork. They weren't alone. Standing a half-step behind them was a man in a charcoal suit carrying a slim leather folio. He had the sharp, predatory look of a lawyer who specializes in difficult negotiations. "Arthur," Eleanor said. Her voice was smooth, devoid of any warmth, as if she were greeting a business associate she had never particularly liked. "You've changed the landscaping. It looks utilitarian." 4 years, Eleanor, I said, my voice sounding raspy even to my own ears. "You didn't come here to discuss the hydrangeas." Julian cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Look, Dad, we don't need to make this a whole thing. We're busy. We just need to handle some business." I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to fish, the young man whose Ivy League tuition I had paid in full without a second thought. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He was looking at the crown molding. "Business," I repeated. "Come in." I led them into the dining room. It's a formal space, one we rarely used when we were a family, dominated by a long cherrywood table that could seat 12. I didn't offer them water. I didn't offer them a seat. I just stood at the head of the table and waited. The lawyer was the first to speak. "Mr. Vance, my name is Marcus Thorne. I represent Mrs. Vance and your son in a matter of estate restructuring. As you may be aware, Julian's venture capital firm has encountered some temporary liquidity challenges." "He's bankrupt, you mean?" I said flatly. Julian flinched. "It's a market correction, Dad. Everyone is hurting." "Not everyone," I countered. Eleanor stepped forward, placing her designer handbag on the table with a soft thud. "Arthur, let's not be tedious. We are here because this house, and your various retirement accounts, represent a significant amount of stagnant capital that our son needs to survive. We've had a document prepared, an early asset distribution agreement. Thorne slid a thick packet of paper across the polished wood. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I could see the number on the top page, highlighted in a discreet gray box. $6 million. $6 million, I murmured. That's nearly half of everything I've built over 40 years, including the equity in this house. It's what's fair, Arthur, Eleanor said, her eyes narrowing. I gave you the best years of my life. I maintained your social standing. I raised your son while you were off building bridges and playing in the dirt. You owe us this. If you sign this now, we can avoid a messy public litigation that would be very embarrassing for a man of your reputation. The shock didn't hit me the way I thought it would. I expected to feel a sharp pain, a sense of betrayal that would knock the wind out of me. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I looked at Eleanor, the woman I had once loved, with a blind, desperate devotion, and I saw a stranger. I saw a predatory bird circling a dying animal. She didn't want to know if I was okay. She didn't want to know about the grandchildren she had never met because she'd poisoned the air between us. She wanted the stagnant capital. She thought I was the same man I was 12 years ago. A man who would do anything for a smile of approval. A man who would sign away his soul just to keep the peace. You think I've been sitting here in the dark for 4 years, just waiting for you to come and take what's left, I said softly. Julian let out a sharp, impatient breath. Dad, come on, you're 68. What are you going to do with all that money anyway? You live like a monk. This could save my company. It could fix everything. It wouldn't fix the fact that you haven't called me since 2022, Julian, I said. I was busy, he snapped. I was building something. So was I said. I looked at the three of them. They looked so confident. They thought they had me cornered. They thought a lonely old man would be easy prey for a high-priced lawyer and a wife who knew exactly where the emotional bruises were. Wait here, I told them. I walked back into my study. The room smelled of old paper and cedar. I went to the bottom drawer of my desk, the one that stays locked. From it, I pulled out a worn, chocolate-brown leather briefcase. The stitching was fraying at the corners, and the brass latches were dull with age. I had carried this briefcase to every job site for 30 years. It had survived rain, mud, and the heat of 100 summers. Inside it wasn't a bridge design or a blueprint. I walked back into the dining room and set the briefcase on the table, right next to their $6 million demand. The sound of it hitting the wood was heavy, solid. Eleanor looked at the briefcase with a sneer of disgust. What is that, Arthur? More old sketches? We don't want your nostalgia. We want the signature. You came here with a list of what you want, I said, my hand resting on the scarred leather. But I've been keeping a list of my own. For 12 years, I've been documenting every market correction, every ignored phone call, and every secret transaction you thought I was too busy in the dirt to notice. I popped the latches. The click echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. You think you're here to take my future, I said, looking Eleanor directly in the eye. But you're actually here to settle the past. And I think you'll find that my accounting is much more thorough than yours. The dining room remained suffocatingly still as I let the latch of the briefcase click, but before I could show them the contents of the present, my mind involuntarily drifted back to the foundations of this mess. You see, you don't build a bridge in a day, and you don't destroy a marriage in one either. It's a slow erosion, 1,000 small betrayals that you convince yourself are just the price of love. I looked at Eleanor's manicured hands, the skin so soft and pale because it had never known the bite of a New England winter or the grit of a construction site. It was a stark contrast to my own calloused, scarred, and permanently stained with the ghost of motor oil and concrete dust. For 30 years, I was the man in the mud so she could be the woman in the light. I remember the late 80s and early 90s, a blur of 16-hour shifts where I'd leave the house at 4, 30 inches the morning, the stars still sharp in the frozen sky, and return long after the moon had climbed over the ridge. I wasn't just building bridges across the Connecticut River. I was building a pedestal for a woman who didn't want a husband. She wanted a benefactor. I remember a specific night, back when Julian was just 10 years old. I had been on site for 22 hours straight because a pour had gone wrong on the bridge deck. My boots were caked in gray sludge. My eyes were bloodshot from the glare of the work lights, and my bones felt like they were made of lead. When I finally pulled into this very driveway, the house was ablaze with light. I could hear the muffled swell of a string quartet and the bright, artificial chime of crystal glasses clinking together. Eleanor was hosting the annual autumn gala for the Greenwich Heritage Society. I walked through the mudroom, hoping to slip upstairs to wash the exhaustion off my skin, but I ran into her in the hallway. She didn't ask if I'd eaten. She didn't ask why my hands were shaking from fatigue. She just looked at my reflective vest and my stained work pants with a grimace of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Arthur, please," she had hissed, pushing me toward the back stairs as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. "The governor is in the parlor. Do not come out until everyone is gone. You look unpresentable." I spent that night sitting on the edge of our bathtub, listening to the laughter and the sophisticated murmurs filtering through the floorboards. I was the one who had paid for the governor's scotch. I was the one who had signed the check for the catering, the flowers, and the very dress she was wearing to impress people who wouldn't know a structural weld from a hole in the ground. I sat there in the dark, smelling of sweat and diesel, realizing for the first time that I was a ghost in my own home. I was the invisible engine that kept her world spinning, and my only job was to stay out of sight so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of her perfect life. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a ghost who could sign checks from the shadows. As I sat there in the present, watching Julian tap his foot impatiently on the Persian rug I'd bought for Eleanor's 15th anniversary, I realized he had learned the lesson well. To him, I wasn't the father who had missed his own sleep to ensure he had the best tutors and the finest gear. I was just the utilitarian old man who didn't fit into the glossy brochures of his life. I looked at the sketches I'd kept in the side pocket of my briefcase, not the blueprints for the bridges, but the sketches of the life I thought we were building. I remember drawing a small gazebo for the backyard, a place where I thought Eleanor and I would sit in our twilight years, watching the fireflies. I had spent weeks on those drawings, calculating the angles, choosing the cedar, imagining the conversations we'd have when the work was finally done. When I showed them to her, she hadn't even looked at the paper. She just complained that a gazebo would clutter the view for the garden party she was planning for the following summer. The solitude of a man who provides is a heavy, silent thing. You tell yourself that the sacrifice is worth it. You tell yourself that the fatigue in your marrow is the currency of your family's happiness. But sitting across from them now, I saw the truth that I had spent decades burying under piles of overtime and missed dinners. Eleanor hadn't just forgotten to invite me to the main table at my own 65th birthday party. She had spent 30 years training everyone to believe I wasn't there at all. I was the bank, the builder, the silent provider, never the guest, and certainly never the host. Even Julian, who I used to take to the job sites when he was little, back before his mother told him that engineers were just glorified laborers, now looked at me with that same curated disdain. He saw the utilitarian father, the man who was too slow for the fast-paced world of venture capital, not the man who had worked until his knuckles bled to make sure he never knew the fear of a plummeting bank balance. "Arthur, you're staring," Eleanor said, her voice snapping me back to the cold reality of the dining room. "If you're going to get sentimental about the good old and gay, save it for someone who cares. We have a flight back to the city in 2 hours. Just sign the agreement and we can end this charade of a family visit." I looked at her, and then at the lawyer, Thorne, who was watching me with the clinical detachment of a surgeon about to perform a necessary amputation. They really believed I was hollowed out. They believed that because I had accepted the silence for so long, I had nothing left to say. What they didn't understand is that an engineer spends his life studying the things that stay hidden. We look at the tension in the cables, the pressure on the pilings, and the way the earth shifts under the weight of the massive structures we build. I had spent my 40 years of mud and grit learning exactly how to wait for the right moment to reveal the structural flaws. "You know, Eleanor," I said, my voice as steady as a structural beam, "I spent 16 hours a day for 3 decades making sure our foundations were deep enough to hold up whatever world you wanted to build. I didn't mind the dirt. I didn't even mind being hidden in the back room while you drank champagne with the governor. I told myself it was for the family." I paused, my fingers tracing the worn edge of the briefcase. But while I was in the mud, I learned something very important about how things collapse. They don't fall because of a single storm. They fall because the people inside the house start digging away at the foundation from the inside. I looked at Julian, who was looking at his Rolex, and I felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but it was close. You think this money will save you, Julian. You think $6 million will fix the fact that you've never built anything that can stand on its own. But you're wrong. You're trying to build a bridge with stolen steel, and it's going to fail just like every other shortcut you've taken. The lawyer cleared his throat, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Mr. Vance, let's keep this professional. Your personal grievances, while understandable, have no bearing on the legal validity of the Kemplis. I'm not talking about grievances, Mr. Thorne, I interrupted, pulling a thick manila folder from the briefcase. I'm talking about records. You see, when you're an engineer, you keep a build log. You document every material, every delay, and every unauthorized change to the original plan. I laid the folder on the table. This isn't about my feelings. This is about the morceau, one of my own ledger, and we're just getting started. They say that a father's greatest pride is seeing his son grow into a better man than he ever was. But sitting across from Julian now, all I see is the wreckage of a man I tried to build on hollow ground. For 30 years, I worked the iron and the earth, thinking that if I poured enough sweat and money into my son's life, he would turn out solid, structural, and resilient. But Julian wasn't raised by me. He was sculpted by Eleanor in the quiet, chilly rooms of this house while I was away at the job sites. She didn't teach him the value of a hard day's work or the integrity of a well-placed bolt. She taught him that the world was a buffet, and his father was simply the man holding the tray. I watched him grow from a boy who used to marvel at my blueprints into a man who looks at me with a mixture of pity and predatory hunger, his eyes always scanning for the next exit or the next handout. Julian didn't just fail to become a man of character. He succeeded in becoming exactly what his mother wanted, a polished, entitled extension of her own vanity, someone who views people as assets to be liquidated and family as a legal obligation that should pay dividends on demand. It's a strange thing to realize that you've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund your own obsolescence. I remember when Julian was 24, fresh out of an expensive business school that I had paid for in cash, standing in this very dining room with a glossy pitch deck and a look of practiced confidence that he had clearly inherited from Eleanor. He told me he was starting a disruptive tech firm, something about logistics and AI, that sounded like a foreign language to a man who still used a physical level and a compass. He needed $200,000 for the seed round. I remember looking at his hands. They were soft, the nails manicured, lacking even a single scar or a speck of grease, and I felt a pang of guilt. I thought that maybe his soft life was my fault for working too hard, so I wrote the check. I told myself it was an investment in his future, but deep down, I knew it was a bribe for his affection, a way to stay relevant in a life that Eleanor had spent years convincing him was superior to mine. That $200,000 disappeared in 6 months. There was no disruption, no tech, no firm. Instead, there were photos on social media, photos Julian didn't know I saw because Eleanor had told him Dad doesn't understand the internet. I saw him on yachts in the Mediterranean, champagne in hand, surrounded by people who looked as expensive and hollow as he did. I saw him at high-stakes poker games in Vegas and driving a rented Ferrari through the hills of Tuscany. He wasn't building a company. He was building a facade, spending my sweat-soaked labor on a lifestyle he hadn't earned. When he came back for more, claiming market volatility, I looked at him and asked for a simple profit and loss statement. He laughed a short, jagged sound and said, "Dad, you wouldn't understand the burn rate of a modern startup. It's not like building a bridge where you just buy more gravel." Eleanor had stepped in then, her voice like silk over a blade, saying, "Arthur, don't be so small-minded. Our son is destined for greatness, not for counting pennies like a common foreman." I realize now that the disrespect wasn't just a byproduct of his upbringing. It was a curriculum. Eleanor had spent years whispering in his ear, telling him that my silence was stupidity, that my calloused hands were a sign of a low ceiling, and that my thriftiness was a cage he needed to break out of. She taught him to use me as a resource, never a mentor. Every time I tried to teach him the basics of finance, how to save, how to value a dollar, how to respect the people who work for you, he would look at his watch or check his phone. He didn't want the wisdom of the engineer. He just wanted the keys to the vault. And because I loved him, because I was desperate to be the father he didn't seem to want, I kept the vault open far longer than I should have. I thought that eventually, the gravity of reality would pull him down to earth, and he would finally ask for my help, not my money. But that day never came. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the present. I remember that summer you told me you were pivoting your business. You came to me in tears, saying the lease on your office was due, and you were about to lose everything. Do you remember what I gave you that day? Julian shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking to the lawyer, and then back to me with a defiant squint. I don't know, Dad. A check, I assume? You were always good for those, at least. No, I said softly. I didn't have the cash on hand that week. I had just paid the property taxes and the insurance on the Greenwich house. So I told you to wait. I told you I would find a way. I looked at Eleanor, who was staring at me with a bored, icy detachment. I went to the safe in my study to get the one thing I had left of my own father, his collection of vintage Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin watches. There were 5 of them. They weren't just gold and gears, Julian. They were the only things my father ever passed down to me. He worked 40 years in the mills to buy those, one by one. They were supposed to be your inheritance. I watched Julian's face. For a split second, a shadow of something, guilt perhaps, or just the fear of being caught, passed over his features. He didn't say anything. When I opened the velvet case that day, I continued, my heart feeling like a cold stone in my chest. It was empty. Not just the watches were gone, but the certificates of authenticity, too. I thought I'd been robbed. I almost called the police, but then I saw a small slip of paper tucked into the corner of the box. A pawn shop receipt from a high-end dealer in Manhattan, dated 3 days prior. Signed in your handwriting, Julian, with your mother's initials as a witness on the back of the ticket. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the lawyer, Thorne, seemed to hold his breath. Eleanor didn't flinch. She just reached for her water glass and took a dainty sip, her eyes never leaving mine. You didn't just take my money, I said, the words feeling heavy and jagged in the air. You took my history. You sold my father's life's work to pay for a weekend in the Hamptons or a botched investment you were too proud to admit was a failure. And you didn't even have the courage to ask. You just reached into the drawer and took it. Because Eleanor told you it was yours anyway, didn't she? She told you I was just an old man who didn't know what he had. It was an emergency, Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice completely devoid of remorse. The watches were just sitting there, gathering dust. Julian needed the capital. It was a family asset, and he is the future of this family. You were being stubborn about the cash, so we took care of it. It's what people in our position do. People in our position, I repeated, a bitter taste in my mouth. You mean thieves. You mean people who strip mine their own parents because they're too lazy to build anything of their own. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a plastic sleeve. Inside was the original pawn ticket, the one I had retrieved from the Manhattan dealer after paying $60,000 of my own savings to buy back my father's soul. I had never told them I found it. I had let them think I was the bumbling old man who had simply misplaced his most prized possessions. This was Merc So, 1-inch my binder. The first documented proof that my son wasn't just a failure as a businessman, but a predator within his own home. This ticket is 8 years old, Julian, I said, sliding the plastic sleeve across the table. It stopped right in front of him. I've had it in this briefcase since the day I walked into that shop and saw my father's name on a sales floor. I waited for you to tell me. I waited years for an apology, or a confession, or even a lie that sounded like the truth. But you never said a word. You just kept coming back for more, didn't you? Always smiling. Always disrupting. Always looking for the next thing to steal while I was out in the mud making sure you had a roof over your head. Julian looked down at the ticket, his face flushing a deep, angry red. For the first time, he looked less like a polished CEO and more like the spoiled, frightened child he had always been underneath. He reached out to grab the ticket, but I placed my hand firmly over it. Don't, I said. That's not your property. It never was. And it's not just a piece of paper, Julian. It's the first page of the ledger that explains exactly why you are going to leave this house with nothing today. You think you're here to negotiate a $6 million payout, but you're actually here to find out what happens when the foundation you've been digging under finally gives way. There is a specific kind of cold that doesn't come from the wind or the snow, but from the realization that you are a stranger in the very life you spent decades building. I remember my 60th birthday like it was a physical wound, a day that was supposed to be a milestone of a life well lived, but instead became the moment the mask finally slipped. Eleanor had spent months planning what she called a diamond jubilee for the man of the house, inviting the elite of Greenwich, the local politicians, and the high society faces that graced the pages of the magazines she kept on our marble coffee table. I spent that morning in my study, looking at my old hard hat and thinking about the 38 years I'd spent, ensuring that the structures people trusted their lives to were sound. I felt a sense of quiet accomplishment, a belief that today, for once, I wouldn't be the man in the mud or the ghost in the shadows. I thought that, at 60, I had finally earned my seat at the head of the table. But as the evening unfolded, I realized that Eleanor's party wasn't a celebration of my life. It was a stage production where I was merely a prop to be managed, a necessary inconvenience to be tucked away so the real stars could shine. If you have ever been the person who spent your entire youth sacrificing, only to realize you were just a tool in the hands of the ones you loved most, you will understand how Arthur feels right now. Don't take your eyes off the screen, because the story is about to turn in a direction that even the most calculating person could not have anticipated. If you feel a sense of empathy, please hit the subscribe button gently so we don't lose each other in the chapters to come. The house was transformed that night into something unrecognizable, a sea of white lilies, silk drapes, and the sort of lighting that makes everything look expensive and untouchable. I had put on the tuxedo Eleanor had ordered for me, a stiff, uncomfortable garment that felt like a costume. As the guests began to arrive, I stood in the foyer, offering my hand and my practiced, tired smile to people I barely knew, people who looked through me as if I were part of the architecture. I kept waiting for Eleanor to lead me to the grand table in the center of the ballroom, the one under the crystal chandelier where Julian was already sitting, laughing with a group of young men who looked like they'd never worked an hour in their lives. But when the dinner bell rang, Eleanor didn't take my arm. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and sharp, and whispered, "Arthur, there's been a slight seating mix-up. The governor's party brought extra guests, and we're just a bit tight at the main table. I've set up a special spot for you near the audio-visual station. You know how you love the technical side of things, and you can keep an eye on the tribute video from there. It's better this way, dear. You'll be more comfortable away from all the fuss." I stood there, frozen, as she glided away to join the laughter and the light. I walked, like a man in a dream, to the far corner of the room, behind a velvet curtain where the sound engineers and the catering staff were working. There was a small, solitary chair tucked between a crate of cables and a busing station. My Diamond Jubilee meal was served on a lukewarm plate by a distracted waiter who didn't even realize I was the guest of honor. From my vantage point in the dark, I watched my wife toast to the man who made all of this possible, her voice dripping with a calculated, theatrical affection that brought the room to their feet in applause. Julian stood up and gave a speech about his visionary father, though he never once looked toward the dark corner where I sat. I realized then that I wasn't just hidden, I was being erased in real time. I was the silent engine they had decided to muffle because the noise of my reality didn't fit the music of their fantasy. The humiliation was a slow, burning acid. I sat there for 3 hours, ignored by the people I was feeding, watching my son drink wine that cost $500 a bottle while I sat next to a trash can. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the absolute, crushing certainty that, to them, I had no dignity left to protect. They thought I was so broken, so conditioned to provide without complaint, that they didn't even have to pretend to respect me anymore. Around 11 o'clock, the air in the ballroom became stifling. I slipped out through the service door and walked into the cool night of the back garden. I didn't want to be seen, so I stayed in the shadows of the tall boxwood hedges near the stone fountain. I just wanted a moment of silence away from the performance. But then I heard voices low, intimate, and familiar. I stepped deeper into the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the leaves I saw Eleanor. She wasn't alone. She was standing with a man I recognized, Robert Sterling, a family friend and an investment lawyer who had been a fixture at our house for years. He was the man Eleanor always turned to for advice when I was away on the bridge sites. They were standing close, far too close for a casual conversation. "God, that was tedious," I heard Robert say, his voice carrying a jagged edge of mockery. "How much longer do we have to play this game, Eleanor? Sitting through speeches about that boring man is exhausting." Eleanor let out a light, melodic laugh, the one she used when she was truly happy, a sound she hadn't made for me in a decade. "It's almost over, Robert. The IPO for Julian's company is only a few months away. Once we have the liquidity, we don't have to worry about Arthur's stolid presence anymore. I've already spoken to the doctors about the cognitive decline narrative. He's so tired and quiet lately, nobody will question it when we decide he needs full-time residential care. The house, the trusts, it will all be under my control. We just have to keep him in the corner a little while longer." "He's a ghost already," Robert said, reaching out to stroke her cheek. "He didn't even complain about sitting with the tech crew. The man has no spine left." "He's not a man, Robert," Eleanor replied, her voice turning cold and sharp. "He's a utility. And you don't keep an old utility when the new model is ready." I stood there in the dark, my hand shaking as I reached into the pocket of my tuxedo. For months, I had been carrying a small, professional-grade digital recorder, a habit from the job site where I needed to dictate notes about structural flaws while my hands were full. I hadn't planned to use it for this. I had pulled it out earlier that day to record a small message of gratitude for my family, thinking I might get a chance to speak. I pressed the record button. The small red light was the only thing glowing in the shadows. I stood perfectly still, a ghost in the hedges, as they discussed the liquidation of my life. They talked about the residential facility they had already scouted in upstate New York. They talked about how they would convince Julian that it was for the best, though Robert joked that Julian wouldn't care as long as his funding was secure. They laughed about my muddy boots and my simple mind. I didn't confront them. I didn't burst through the hedges and demand an explanation. An engineer knows that you don't stop a collapse by standing under the falling beams. You step back, you document the failure, and you prepare for the demolition. I waited until they walked back toward the house, their silhouettes framed by the warm light of the ballroom. I looked down at the small black device in my hand. The red light was still on, pulsing like a heartbeat. I hit save and tucked it back into my pocket. I didn't go back to the party. I walked to the garage, got into my old truck, the one Eleanor hated, and I drove. I drove for hours until the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, realizing that my 60th birthday wasn't the end of my life. It was the birth of the Navy binder. As I sat at the dining room table in the present, watching Eleanor's face pale as I pulled a set of headphones from the briefcase, I felt a strange sense of peace. "You remember my 60th, don't you, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The Diamond Jubilee. You told me there was a seating mix-up. You told me I'd be more comfortable in the dark." I laid the digital recorder on the table between us. "But the thing about the dark is that you hear things so much more clearly. And I've been listening to this recording every night for 4 years. It's item number 4 in the ledger. Would you like to hear what the utility has to say now?" Sometimes, the most violent moments in a marriage don't involve shouting or shattered glass. They happen in the absolute, freezing silence of a person who has decided you no longer exist. I learned this 4 years ago, during the week the frost moved from the ground into the very marrow of my home. People often ask why I stayed so long, why I allowed myself to be a shadow in a house I paid for, and the answer is as simple as it is heartbreaking. I believed that if I just held the foundation steady enough, eventually the people inside would feel safe enough to love me back. But a foundation doesn't get gratitude, it just gets walked on. The breaking point wasn't the millions of dollars or the high society snobbery. It was a small 2-bedroom cottage in the Berkshire Mountains that belonged to my parents. It was a place that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, a place where I wasn't Arthur the ATM or Arthur the utilitarian, but just Arthur. When Eleanor demanded I liquidate my soul to fund Julian's latest Manhattan fantasy, and I finally said no, the house didn't explode. It simply went dark. I was left alone in a sickbed, watching the snow fall outside my window, realizing that my wife and son hadn't just moved out. They had performed an emotional autopsy on a man who was still very much alive. The argument happened in the kitchen. Right beneath the bright, decorative lights Eleanor had installed for one of her endless fundraisers. She didn't come at me with anger. She came with that chilling, executive efficiency she used when she wanted to reorganize a life. Julian was standing by the island, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone, showing Eleanor photos of a glass-walled penthouse in Chelsea. It was priced at $4.8 million. He didn't ask me if I had the money. He asked Eleanor if we could make the down payment happen by Friday. "Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice as smooth as polished stone, "we've discussed this. Julian needs a presence in the city, if his firm is going to be taken seriously. That cottage in the Berkshires, the one your father left you, it's just sitting there. The market is at a peak. If you sell it this week, we can cover the closing costs and the first year of Julian's expenses. It's the logical move for the family's future." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. That cottage was where my father had taught me how to read a level. It was the only place left on earth that felt like it belonged to me, not to the Vance estate. I looked at Julian, who was looking at a photo of a rooftop pool, and then at Eleanor. "I'm not selling it, Eleanor," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was the firmest thing I had said in 20 years. That house is my history. I've given you the Greenwich mansion, the cars, the accounts. I've given Julian $2 million in seed money that he turned into vapor. I am keeping the cottage. The silence that followed was heavy, structural. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't even blink. She just looked at me with a profound, terrifying lack of interest. "I see," she said. "You're choosing a pile of rotting wood over your son's career. You're choosing the past over us." "I'm choosing myself for once," I countered. "Well then," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "If you want to live in the past, Arthur, you can stay there. But you will stay there alone. From this moment on, you are dead to us. You aren't a husband, and you aren't a father. You're just a ghost in a big house. Don't expect us to haunt it with you." They left 2 days later. I stood by the window and watched the movers carry out the silk rugs, the designer chairs, and the crates of wine I had paid for. Julian didn't look back. He didn't even wave. Eleanor walked to her car with her head held high, looking as though she were finally stepping out of a tomb. They didn't leave a forwarding address. They didn't leave a note. They just left the silence. 3 weeks after they vanished, the pneumonia hit. It started as a dry cough in the back of my throat, something I tried to ignore while I sat in my quiet study. By the 3rd day, my fever had spiked to 103, and my lungs felt like they were being filled with wet sand. I lay in that massive, empty master bedroom, the sheets cold and damp with sweat, staring at the ceiling. I reached for my phone a dozen times. I wanted to call Julian. I wanted to tell him I was scared. I wanted to hear him say, "Dad, I'm coming home." I called him once, at 2:00 inches the morning when the delirium was starting to set in. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice cracking and thin. "Julian, it's Dad. I'm not doing well. I think I need help." I called Eleanor. She had blocked my number. I spent 5 days in that bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. The only sound in the house was the wind rattling the window panes and the heavy, ragged sound of my own breathing. I realized then the true depth of the cognitive decline narrative Eleanor had mentioned to her lover. They weren't waiting for me to lose my mind. They were waiting for me to lose my life. If I had died in that bed, they wouldn't have found me for weeks, and they would have walked back in to claim the stagnant capital without a single tear. I was a utility that had been decommissioned. I survived because of a neighbor's gardener who noticed I hadn't picked up the mail in nearly a week and called for a welfare check. When the paramedics wheeled me out of the house on a stretcher, I looked at the grand foyer, the crystal chandelier, and the polished marble floors, and for the first time, I didn't see a home. I saw a tomb I had built for myself with my own overtime and my own silence. While I was in the hospital, hooked up to an IV and a nebulizer, I had plenty of time to think. I remembered the way Eleanor had said I was dead to them. I thought about how Julian hadn't checked in even after seeing my missed call. It was during those long, sterile nights in the pulmonary ward that I realized the Navy binder wasn't just a record of their betrayal, it was my resurrection. They wanted me dead? Fine. Arthur Vance, the ATM, was dead. Arthur Vance, the man who provided without question, was buried under 4 inches of Connecticut snow. But the man who remained? The man who had built bridges that survived hurricanes? He was still standing. I spent my recovery time in that hospital bed not watching television, but scrolling through bank statements on my laptop, documenting the exact moment Eleanor had transferred $50,000 from our joint account to a private one the day she left. I documented the ignored call logs. I documented the fact that not one get well card arrived from the woman who had spent 30 years pretending to be my partner. As I sat at the dining room table now, 4 years later, I looked at Eleanor's perfect face, and I saw the confusion starting to ripple through her composure. She didn't expect a ghost to have a pulse. She certainly didn't expect a ghost to have receipts. "You said I was dead to you, Eleanor," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the fever that had nearly claimed me. "And for a while, I almost believed you. I lay in that bed for 5 days waiting for a phone call that never came. I watched the snow cover the driveway and realized that if I disappeared, you'd only be upset about the delay in the probate court. I pulled a medical report from the briefcase, the one from the hospital stay 4 years ago. I laid it on top of the digital recording. This is item number 5, my hospital admission records. And right next to it is the cell phone bill from that same week, showing the 16 calls I placed to you and Julian that went unreturned while my lungs were failing. I looked at Julian, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. You were in Chelsea that week, Julian. I saw the credit card charges for a housewarming party you threw while I was on a ventilator. You spent $12,000 on catering the same night I was signing a medical power of attorney because I didn't think I'd make it to morning. Dad, I didn't know it was that bad, Julian stammered, his voice weak. Mom said you were just being dramatic to get us to come back. She told you I was a ghost, I said, leaning forward. And she was right. But ghosts have a funny way of remembering the people who buried them alive. There is a peculiar kind of loyalty that doesn't grow in the fertile soil of shared wealth or high society influence, but rather in the quiet, dusty corners of shared history and genuine compassion. For years, as I sat in this massive, echoing house in Greenwich, I believed I was entirely alone, a forgotten relic of a life Eleanor had successfully liquidated. But an engineer knows that even the most isolated structure relies on a secondary support system, a hidden beam that takes the weight when the primary pillars crumble. For me, that support arrived in the form of Clara, my niece, the daughter of my late younger brother, Sam. While Eleanor and Julian were busy scouting Chelsea penthouses and curating their cognitive decline narrative, Clara was the one who showed up at my door with a Tupperware container of homemade lasagna and a laptop bag. She didn't come because she wanted a seat at the table or a line in the will. She came because she remembered the man I was before I became a utility. In the 4 years of my forced isolation, Clara became the silent architect of my defense, the digital ghost who helped me organize my chaos into a weapon. She taught me that blood is thicker than water, but truth is the thickest of all. I remember the first day she arrived, only a few weeks after I'd returned from the hospital following the pneumonia that nearly took my life. The house felt like a tomb, the heating system was rattling like old bones, and I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a stack of medical bills I didn't have the energy to sort. The doorbell rang, a sound that usually filled me with dread, but when I opened it, there was Clara. She looked so much like Sam, it made my throat tight. She had the same messy chestnut hair and those observant, kind eyes that seemed to look right through the pretenses of the world. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked in, set a bag of groceries on the counter, and gave me a hug that felt like the first real human contact I'd had in a decade. "Uncle Arthur," she said, her voice steady and warm, "you look like you've been living in a construction site with no blueprints. Why didn't you call me?" "I didn't want to be a burden, Clara," I managed to say, feeling the heavy weight of my pride shifting. "Everyone else seems to have moved on to more profitable ventures." She just shook her head and started putting milk in the refrigerator. "Well, I'm not everyone else, and I'm certainly not interested in a venture. I'm interested in you." Over the next few months, Clara became a fixture in my life. She was a data analyst by trade, a woman who lived in the world of spreadsheets and digital forensics, and she was horrified by what Eleanor and Julian had done. She saw the utilitarian treatment for exactly what it was, a systematic stripping of a man's dignity. It was Clara who suggested we start the digital ledger. She noticed that I was keeping paper receipts, old recordings, and handwritten notes in a chaotic mess in my study. "Uncle Arthur," she told me one evening while we were sitting in the study, the light from her dual monitors casting a blue glow over my old blueprints, Paper can be burned. Paper can be lost or stolen. If we're going to protect you, we need to digitize everything. We need to create a cloud-based repository that they can't touch. Every returned card, every ignored voicemail, every suspicious bank transfer, we're going to link them all together. She spent hundreds of hours with me, sitting at that desk, scanning every single page of the Navy binder. She was the one who showed me how to track the metadata on Eleanor's emails, proving that she was communicating with Robert Sterling about my mental state months before they even left the house. Clara was the one who found the digital footprint of Julian's startup, revealing that the $2 million I'd given him hadn't gone towards software development, but had been funneled through a series of shell companies to pay for his Mediterranean yacht rentals. She turned my grief into data, and my data into an insurance policy. But Clara was more than just a technician. She was a witness. She was there when I would wake up from nightmares about the hospital. She was there when I felt too weak to continue the fight. She reminded me that being utilitarian wasn't a crime, but treating a person like a tool certainly was. She never asked for a dime, even when I tried to pay her for her time. "Save it for the gazebo, Uncle Arthur," she'd joke. "The one you're going to build when this is all over." However, the most revealing moment of Clara's loyalty didn't happen in my presence. It was something she told me months later, after we had already built the bulk of the digital ledger. It was during the 3rd year of my isolation. Eleanor, it seemed, had become nervous. She knew I was still in the house, and she knew that I wasn't fading away as quickly as her cognitive decline narrative required. She had somehow found out that Clara was visiting me regularly. Eleanor, ever the strategist, hadn't tried to call me. She had tried to subvert my only ally. Clara told me she had received an invitation for tea at an upscale hotel in the city. When she arrived, Eleanor was waiting for her, looking every bit the grieving, concerned wife. Eleanor was very direct, Clara told me as we sat in the kitchen, the memory of it making her jaw tighten. She told me she was so worried about your mental state. She said you were becoming paranoid, that you were hoarding documents and inventing slights that never happened. Then, she slid a velvet box across the table. Inside was a diamond bracelet, the kind that costs more than my car. "She tried to buy you," I whispered, the coldness of Eleanor's calculations still finding ways to surprise me. She told me that if I acted as a neutral observer and provided her with regular updates on your erratic behavior, she would make sure I was She actually said, "Arthur is confused, Clara. He doesn't know what's best for him anymore. We need to help him find a quiet place to rest, and we need family who understands the bigger picture." "What did you do?" I asked. Clara smiled, a sharp, Sam-like grin. I told her that my picture of the family was quite clear, and that diamonds didn't look very good on a witness stand. I left the bracelet on the table and walked out. "But before I did, Uncle Arthur, I did something I think you'll appreciate." She opened her laptop and played an audio file. It was a recording of the entire meeting. Clara had been carrying a recorder of her own. Eleanor's voice was clear. Her attempt to bribe Clara into becoming a false witness for my commitment to a mental facility was documented in high-definition audio. As I sat in the present day, looking at Eleanor's stunned expression, as I mentioned Clara's name, I saw the exact moment the floor fell out from under her. She had thought Clara was a weak link, a young woman who could be swayed by the promise of Greenwich wealth. She hadn't realized that Clara was the one holding the keys to the digital vault. "You remember Clara, don't you, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice as steady as a structural weld. "The niece you tried to buy in a hotel lobby? The one you tried to turn into a spy for your cognitive decline fantasy?" I pulled a small USB drive from the briefcase, the physical backup of the cloud repository Clara and I had built. "This is item number 6. The recording of your meeting with Clara. It turns out that loyalty is the one thing you can't itemize on a balance sheet. Clara didn't just take care of me when I was sick. She helped me build the bridge that's going to lead you and Julian right out of my life." I looked at the USB drive, then back at Eleanor. "You spent 4 years trying to find a key to my mind so you could lock it away. But Clara? She's the one who kept the keys to the truth." The silence in the dining room had shifted from the heavy, expectant air of a heist to the panicked stillness of a courtroom where the defendant realizes the judge has already seen the tapes. I sat there, my fingers brushing the worn leather of the briefcase, feeling the weight of the paper inside. For years, Eleanor and Julian had seen this briefcase as a symbol of my laborer status, a relic of a man who worked in the mud and spoke in blueprints. They never realized that an engineer doesn't just build, an engineer audits. We check the stress points. We look for the hairline fractures in the concrete long before the bridge actually snaps. As I reached into the briefcase to pull out the first of the digital printouts Clara had helped me organize, I realized that these weren't just documents. They were the invoices for a life they had tried to steal while I was still living it. I wasn't just holding a collection of grievances. I was holding the structural analysis of their character, and the report was damning. My friends, have you ever wondered why the hardest working people are often the ones forgotten in their own homes? Seeing Arthur meticulously label every invoice of betrayal, my heart aches for his 30 years of sacrifice. Perhaps silence is not weakness. It is the way they gather evidence for a long overdue freedom. You brought a $6 million demand to this table, Eleanor, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. But let's talk about the bills you've already rung up on my account. Not just the money, but the cost of the lies. I pulled out a stapled set of papers. The top one, a cold rainy photo of a mangled fender and a legal document from a local body shop. This is item number 7. Do you remember the summer of 2019, Julian? You told me a mechanic at the dealership had joy-ridden your car and totaled it while it was in for service. You came to me shaking, saying you needed $80,000 for a new one because the dealership's insurance was fighting the claim. Julian didn't answer. He just stared at the photo, his jaw working silently. I paid it, I continued. I paid it because I wanted to believe my son was a victim of a dishonest system. But Clara found the police report you thought you'd suppressed. You weren't at the dealership. You were leaving a club in the Hamptons at 3 a.m, with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. You hit a parked delivery truck and then paid the mechanic $10,000 of my money to lie and say the car was on his lot when it happened. You didn't just wreck a car. Julian, you bought a man's silence with my labor, and you did it while I was on site in a rainstorm, making sure the bridge you drive over every weekend was safe. I didn't wait for him to defend himself. I turned to Eleanor. And you, Eleanor, you've always been so careful with the family image. But let's look at the item number 8. I laid out a series of canceled checks, each one signed with a signature that looked like mine, but the slant was all wrong. These are the checks you signed while I was in the hospital with pneumonia. You thought I wouldn't check the ledger because I was confused or declining. Over $400,000, transferred to a shell corporation registered in Robert Sterling's name. You weren't just paying for Julian's lifestyle. You were funding your exit strategy with the money I earned while I was literally fighting for my next breath. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice a sharp, jagged edge. It was for the estate, Arthur. You were incapacitated. Someone had to manage the funds. Robert was merely holding them in trust to protect them from your erratic tendencies. Erratic? I asked, a small, cold smile touching my lips. Is that what we're calling it now? That leads us to the most interesting part of the briefcase. Item number 9. I pulled out a thick packet of correspondence on the letterhead of a prominent psychiatric clinic in New York. I watched the color drain from Eleanor's face, leaving her looking gray and brittle under the dining room lights. Clara and I spent a long time tracing the emails you sent to Dr. Arasov, I said. You spent nearly a year trying to get a professional to sign off on a declaration of permanent cognitive incompetence for me. You sent him edited videos of me in the garden, moments when I was just tired or pensive, and you tried to frame them as episodes of disorientation. You even offered the clinic a generous donation from the Vance Trust, if they would expedite the process so you could take over as my legal guardian. I leaned forward, the shadows of the dining room making the lines on my face look like deep, permanent canyons. The only reason you failed, Eleanor, is because the doctor had a shred of ethics you didn't anticipate. He refused to diagnose a man he hadn't met. So you moved to Plan B, the silence. You figured if you couldn't lock me in a ward, you'd just bury me in this house and wait for the pneumonia to do the job for you. Julian looked at his mother, a flicker of genuine shock in his eyes. Mom, you tried to have him committed? It was for his safety, she hissed, though she wouldn't look at either of us. He was hoarding things, Julian. He was obsessed with these binders. He wasn't the man he used to be. No, I corrected her. I was exactly the man I've always been. I was the man who keeps the records. I was the man who knows that every structure has a load-bearing limit, and you and Julian finally exceeded mine. You thought my silence was a sign of a failing mind, but it was actually the sound of me finally stopping the engine. I stopped providing the fuel, and I started watching the lights go out. I swept my hand across the table, over the invoices of their betrayal. You came here today with a list of what you need. Retirement funds, mortgage payoffs, college funds for a grandson I've never seen. You calculated your future down to the cent. But you forgot to subtract the debt you owe to the man who built it all. You owe me 9 years of birthday cards. You owe me the 5 days I spent dying alone in that bed while you were throwing parties. You owe me the watches you stole from my father's drawer. I reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a small, blue-stamped document. It wasn't an invoice. It was a formal notification of a forensic audit I had requested through the state's Financial Crimes Division. This is the final bill, I said. I've spent the last 4 years documenting every kited check, every fraudulent signature, and every attempt at medical coercion. I don't need a lawyer to tell me what's fair, Eleanor. I have the receipts. And the receipts say that the Vance estate is closed for business. The lawyer, Thorne, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally reached out and pulled the psychiatric correspondence toward him. He scanned it quickly, his professional mask finally cracking. He looked at Eleanor, then at me, and he slowly closed his folio. He knew what an engineer knew. When the structural report says the bridge is condemned, there's no point in arguing with the gravity that's about to pull it down. Arthur, Eleanor whispered, her voice finally breaking. We're your family. You can't do this. What will people think? They'll think exactly what the records show, I said, standing up. My knees popped, a reminder of the years on the job sites, but I had never felt taller. That you were the architects of a house of cards, and you finally ran out of wind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think it's time you took your liquidity challenges somewhere else. The utility has been disconnected. The air in the dining room had reached a point of saturation, that heavy, electric stillness that precedes a devastating storm. I sat at the head of the table, my hands resting loosely on the worn leather of the briefcase, feeling the hum of the house around me. It's a strange thing to realize that the person you shared a bed with for 30 years has no idea who you actually are. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes darting from the forensic audit papers to the digital recorder, and I could see the gears of her social engineering mind spinning at a frantic pace. She didn't see a husband she had wronged. She saw a structural flaw in her meticulously crafted narrative that needed to be paved over. For decades, I was the man who provided the means for her to be the sun in our social galaxy. But she forgot that the sun doesn't just illuminate, it burns. And now, as the shadows of our shared history stretched long across the cherry-wood table, she was realizing that the man she had tried to bury in the dark was the only one who actually knew where all the bodies were hidden. The silence grew thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a sound that felt like a countdown. Eleanor finally straightened her back, her face hardening into that terrifyingly polished mask of the Greenwich matriarch. She didn't look defeated. She looked like a general preparing for a scorched earth campaign. "You think you've won, don't you, Arthur?" she said, her voice dropping into a low, vibrato hiss that felt like a razor against the skin. "You think these little papers and your secret recordings give you the upper hand, but you've forgotten one very important thing. In this town, in our circle, the truth is whatever people are willing to believe. And I have spent 30 years making sure they believe in me." I watched her, my pulse steady, my breathing deep and rhythmic. I didn't feel the flash of anger I would have felt years ago. Instead, I felt a profound sense of detachment, the kind of calm an engineer feels when a controlled demolition begins exactly as planned. "Go on, Eleanor," I said quietly. "Tell me what people are going to believe." "They will believe that you are a broken man who has lost his grip on reality," she said, leaning forward until the scent of her perfume cloyed in the space between us. "They will see a husband who, in his old age, became paranoid and abusive, driving his family away. I have friends in the press, Arthur. I have social chairs and board members who have watched me suffer your absences for years. By tomorrow morning, the story won't be about Julian's liquidity challenges or my management of the funds. It will be about the tragic decline of Arthur Vance. I will tell them how you've been hoarding documents in that briefcase like a madman. I will tell them you've been threatening us. By the time I'm done, you won't be able to walk into the diner in Greenwich without people looking at you with pity or disgust." Julian joined in then, his voice gaining a desperate, shrill confidence. "She's right, Dad. Nobody cares about forensic audits. They care about reputations. If you don't sign that agreement, we'll make sure everyone knows you're a bitter, delusional old man who's trying to punish his son for being more successful than he ever was. We'll make you a pariah." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly under my weight. I looked at the two of them, the people I had spent my life protecting, the ones I had missed countless birthdays and anniversaries for, so they could have this very table to sit at. The sheer arrogance of their threat was almost breathtaking. They truly believed that the social house of cards they had built was stronger than the concrete and steel of the truth. "It's interesting," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room. "You talk about reputation as if it's something you can just paint over a crumbling wall. You think you can use the cognitive decline story to pave over the fact that you tried to commit me for profit. You think the town will take your side because you hosted the right galas." "They will," Eleanor snapped. "I am the heart of this community. You are just the man who signs the checks. Without me, you're nothing but a laborer with a bank account." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her with a level of calm that I could see was starting to unnerve her. When you spend 30 years in the mud, you learn that the loudest noises don't always mean the most danger. The most dangerous things are the silent shifts in the earth. "Eleanor," I said, "I've lived in the shadows of this house for so long that I've learned to see quite well in the dark. You think your friends at the club will stand by you? You think the board members will protect you?" I pulled a single handwritten note from the side pocket of the briefcase. It was on heavy, cream-colored stationery I recognized immediately. "This is a note from Linda, the head of the Heritage Society. She's been asking questions, Eleanor. Questions about why the Vance Trust donation for the hospital wing was $60,000 short this year. She's been asking why Robert Sterling's name keeps appearing on the Society's internal ledger." Eleanor's hand twitched on the table. "You see," I continued, "while you were busy planning how to boignor my name, I was having tea with the people you think you control. Not as Arthur the utilitarian, but as Arthur, the man who actually funded their projects. It turns out that when people find out the generous Eleanor Vance has been en route from the very charities she leads to pay for her son's yacht rentals, they lose their appetite for loyalty." You talked to Linda?" Eleanor stammered, the first crack appearing in her mask. "I talked to everyone," I said. "I showed them the Murkso 8 inches my ledger, the cancelled checks with the forged signatures. I showed them the medical power of attorney you tried to coerce. I didn't have to say much. The numbers spoke for themselves. An engineer's truth is always in the math, Eleanor, and your math doesn't add up." I looked at Julian, whose bravado had completely evaporated, leaving him looking small and frightened in his expensive suit. "And as for you, Julian, the successful businessman, I've already sent the digital footprints of your shell companies to the investors you lied to, the ones you told that I was on board with your latest pivot. I think you'll find that their liquidity will be the least of your concerns by the end of the week." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a heist. It was the silence of an empty tomb. Eleanor slumped back in her chair, the light of the chandelier catching the sweat on her forehead. The pariah narrative she had tried to weaponize had turned back on her before she could even fire the first shot. "You've been planning this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For 4 years. You sat here and watched us, and you planned this." "I didn't plan for you to betray me, Eleanor," I said, my heart feeling heavy but clear. "I only planned for the day you would eventually come back to collect what you thought you were owed. I didn't want to be right. I would have given anything for that doorbell to ring and for it to be a wife who missed her husband, or a son who wanted to know how his father's heart was doing." I stood up, the chair legs scraping against the floor, a final, decisive sound. "But you didn't bring love. You brought a demand for $6 million. You brought a lawyer. You brought threats of social assassination." I closed the briefcase, the latches snapping shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. I looked at the two strangers across from me, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't see people I needed to protect. I saw a project that had exceeded its load-bearing limit and had finally, inevitably, collapsed. The battle for the dining room is over, I said, picking up the briefcase. And Eleanor? Don't worry about the press. I've already given them the only story that matters. The one with the receipts. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't cry or scream, a heavy, silent realization that settles in the pit of your stomach and stays there for years, turning every memory into a question mark. For over 3 decades, I believed I was building a legacy, a bridge across time that would carry my name through my son, Julian. I looked at him and saw my future. The reason I worked until my hands bled and my back felt like it was fused with iron. But 10 years ago, during a routine preoperative screening for a minor gallbladder surgery, the world I had constructed brick by brick didn't just lean, it vanished. The doctor had sat me down, looking confused by the blood type compatibility on my chart, and told me in a quiet, clinical voice that it was biologically impossible for me to be Julian's father. In that sterile room, the light felt too bright, and the air felt too thin. I walked out of that hospital as a man who had lost his history, yet I went home and looked at Julian, then a young man full of ambition, and his mother's sharp features, and I chose to keep loving him. I chose to believe that fatherhood was built of sweat and sacrifice, not just DNA. I spent 10 more years protecting a lie, hoping that the son I raised would be worth the truth I buried. But sitting here now, watching him try to dismantle my life for a few $1,000,000, I realize that some foundations are so rotten that no amount of love can keep the structure from falling. The dining room felt smaller now, the shadows deeper, as I sat there looking at the 2 people who had shared my table while plotting my erasure. Eleanor was still trying to maintain her composure, her chin tilted up in that practiced gesture of defiance, but her eyes were dartingly nervous. Julian was slumped in his chair, his face pale, looking like a man who had just realized the bridge he was standing on was suspended by nothing but thin air. I felt a profound, weary sadness for the man I used to be, the man who would have done anything to protect them from the truth. You know, Julian, I began, my voice low and steady, I used to sit in the stands at your baseball games and wonder why you didn't have my build. I'm a big man, broad-shouldered, built for the kind of work my father and grandfather did. You were always lean, agile, with a way of moving that was almost elegant. I used to tell myself it was just a recessive gene, or that you took after Eleanor's side of the family. I didn't care. To me, you were the boy I held in the hospital, the one I stayed up with when you had the croup, the one I taught to ride a bike on this very driveway. Julian looked up at me, his brow furrowed. What are you talking about, Dad? What does my baseball games have to do with any of this? I looked at Eleanor. Her face had gone completely bloodless. She knew. She had known for 32 years, and she had watched me pour my life's blood into another man's child without a single flicker of remorse. 10 years ago, I continued, I went in for that surgery. You remember, Eleanor? You were too busy with the museum gala to take me, so Clara drove me. The doctors ran some tests. They found out something that changed everything for me. They found out that we don't share the same blood, Julian. Not a drop of it. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me, then at Eleanor, his head shaking in a slow, rhythmic denial. That's impossible. Mom? Eleanor didn't move. She looked like a statue carved from ice. Arthur, you're being delusional. The stress has finally broken you. You're making up stories to hurt us because you're bitter. I have the lab reports, Eleanor, I said, reaching into the briefcase and pulling out a yellowed hospital folder. I didn't hand it to her. I laid it on the table like a tombstone. I've had them for a decade. I could have walked away then. I could have divorced you, cut Julian off, and saved myself 10 years of labor and millions of dollars. But I didn't. I looked at Julian, and I saw my son. I thought that the man who raises a child, the man who provides for him and loves him, is the real father. I was willing to take that secret to my grave, if it meant we stayed a family. I turned back to Julian, who was staring at the folder as if it contained a venomous snake. I loved you, Julian. Even after I knew you weren't mine, I worked 16 hours a day to fund your dreams. I paid for the schools, the cars, the failed businesses. I did it because I believed in the bond we built, not the one in the blood. I thought that if I gave you everything, you would at least give me respect. But for the last 4 years, You've treated me like an old machine that's outlived its usefulness. You've plotted with your mother to put me in a facility so you could liquidate the stagnant capital of my life." Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. I didn't. I didn't know. No, I said. You didn't know. Because I protected you from it. But Eleanor knew. She's known since the day you were conceived. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, picking up the digital recorder I had used to record the garden conversation on my 60th birthday. I pressed a different button, one that played a file Clara had helped me recover from an old discarded cell phone of Eleanor's that she'd found in the attic. It was a series of voice memos Eleanor had recorded for herself, a sort of digital diary she'd kept during the years I was away on the bridge sites. The voice that came out was Eleanor's, but it was younger, more vibrant, and filled with a passion she had never shown me. Asterisk. Robert says the baby has his eyes. I have to be so careful when Arthur is home. He's so oblivious, so buried in his blueprints, he doesn't even see the resemblance. Robert wants to tell him, but I can't let that happen. Arthur is the one with the steady income, the one with the pension. Robert is a dreamer, but Arthur is the foundation. We'll raise Julian as a Vance, and Arthur will never have to know that he's paying for Robert Sterling's legacy. Asterisk, Julian let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a gasp. He looked at his mother, as if she were a monster he was seeing for the first time. Robert Sterling, the family friend, the man who had been at every party, every holiday dinner, the man who had stood in the garden on my 60th birthday and laughed about how I was a boring ghost. He's your father, Julian, I said, the words feeling like a final, heavy seal. The man you've been consulting with for your business pivots. The man your mother has been funneling my money to for years. You're not a Vance. You're a Sterling. And you've spent the last decade trying to destroy the only man who actually gave a damn about you so you could please the man who didn't even have the courage to claim you. Eleanor finally snapped. She stood up, knocking her chair back, her face twisted in a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. And what if he is? You were never enough, Arthur. You were a laborer, a man who smelled of sweat and concrete. Robert is a man of intellect, of culture. He understood me in a way your simple mind never could. You should be grateful we gave you a son to be proud of, even if he wasn't yours. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no love, no pain. Just a profound sense of relief that the bridge had finally collapsed. I'm not grateful, Eleanor, I said. I'm finished. I chose to be a father to a boy I loved. But you and Julian, you chose to be predators. You chose to bite the hand that was holding you up. I closed the briefcase. The sound was final. Julian, I said, looking at the young man who had once been my whole world. I raised you as a Vance. I gave you the name of a man who builds things to last. But you've proven you have your father's blood after all. You're a Sterling. You take, you lie, and you leave. So, you can go to Robert now. You can ask him for the $6 million. You can ask him to fund your next pivot. I walked toward the door, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood. But as of this moment, the Vance estate is closed. And so is my heart. I'm going to the Berkshires, to the house my real father built. And you two? You're free to go build your life on the lies you've been telling for 30 years. Just don't be surprised when it falls down. It is a terrifying thing to witness the moment a person's soul finally rots through the surface of their skin. For decades, I lived with a woman who moved through the world like a saint in silk, a pillar of the community whose name was synonymous with grace and charity. I spent my life in the mud and the grit so that she could sit at the head of gala tables, handing out oversized checks to orphans and hospitals. I was proud of her. I thought my labor was the engine behind her goodness. But standing in this dining room now, watching the lamplight hit the jagged edges of her rage, I realized that Eleanor didn't have a heart for the vulnerable. She had a talent for the heist. She wasn't building a legacy of kindness. She was building a fortress of fraud, using the very charities she led to launder the sweat of my brow into the pockets of her son and her lover. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a lifetime of lies. A heavy, airless vacuum where the truth finally rushes in to fill the space. Eleanor thinks she still has a move left to make, but an engineer knows that once the core support has snapped, there is no amount of decorative paint that can hide the fact that the entire structure is coming down. The air in the room was thick, tasting of old dust and the bitter scent of Eleanor's expensive tea. Marcus Thorne, the lawyer, sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the psychiatric reports I had laid out earlier. He was a smart man. He knew the wind had changed. Julian was staring at the floor, his breathing ragged, looking like a child who had just found out the monsters under the bed were actually the people who tucked him in. Eleanor was the only one still fighting, her hands gripping the edge of the cherrywood table, so hard her knuckles were white, like bone. "You think this changes anything, Arthur?" she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating tremor. "So Julian isn't your blood. So I had a life outside of your boring, dusty shadows. That doesn't give you the right to throw us out like trash. I am still your wife. I am still the face of the Vance name in this town. You wouldn't dare humiliate me publicly. It would destroy you, too." "I'm already destroyed, Eleanor," I said, and for the first time, it didn't hurt to say it. "You destroyed me when you left me to die in that bed. You destroyed me when you tried to erase my mind to get to my money. I'm just the ghost who's left to clean up the wreckage. The most shocking truth about Julian is about to be completely stripped bare, and I promise you, this twist will make Eleanor pay dearly for her arrogance. Do not leave at this moment because we are reaching the most breathless seconds of the story. You can subscribe to the channel right now to make sure you don't miss this explosive concluding chapter." I reached back into the brown leather briefcase. It felt lighter now, as if the weight of the secrets was finally being transferred from the leather to the air. I pulled out a final blue folder, one that Clara had spent months compiling using the digital footprints. Eleanor thought she had scrubbed from the Heritage Society's servers. "Let's talk about the Eleanor Vance Foundation for Children's Health," I said quietly. Eleanor flinched. It was a small movement, just a flicker in her eyelids, but it was enough. "You've been the chairperson for 15 years, I continued, sliding a series of bank ledgers across the table toward Marcus Thorne. "Last year, the foundation reported a $200,000 expenditure for administrative consulting, but Clara traced the routing numbers. That money didn't go to consultants. It went to a holding company in the Caymans, which then paid out the lease on Julian's Chelsea penthouse and a series of wire transfers to Robert Sterling's private brokerage account. That's a lie," Eleanor whispered, but the strength was gone from her voice. "It's not a lie, Eleanor. It's embezzlement," I said, "and it's not just one check, it's dozens. Over the last 5 years, you've diverted nearly $3 million from donor funds. Money meant for pediatric equipment, money meant for scholarships. You used it to subsidize a life you couldn't afford on your own. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from every person who trusted your face on those brochures." Marcus Thorne picked up the ledgers, his professional mask finally replaced by a look of profound discomfort. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes widening as he saw the systematic nature of the theft. He looked at Eleanor, then at me, and he pushed the asset distribution agreement away from him toward the center of the table. "Mrs. Vance," Thorne said, his voice cold and clinical. "If these records are accurate, this isn't a civil negotiation anymore. This is a federal matter." "I've already had a forensic accountant verify every line, Mr. Thorne," I said. "And I have the affidavits from the bank tellers you thought you'd charmed, Eleanor. It turns out that when a woman in a $5,000 coat asks for special handling on a charity account, people remember. Eleanor's mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She slumped back into her chair, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at the blue folder as if it were a mirror reflecting the monster she had become. The Greenwich matriarch, the saint of the Heritage Society, was gone. In her place was a terrified woman who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. "What do you want, Arthur?" she asked, her voice broken and thin. "I want you to leave," I said. "I want you and Julian and your lawyer to walk out of that door right now. You will take nothing but the clothes you're wearing. You will sign a full renunciation of any claim to the Vance estate, the trusts, and this house. And in return, I won't call the FBI. Not today." Eleanor looked up, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. "But," I added, leaning forward until I could see the fine lines of panic around her mouth, "if I ever see your face in this town again, if you ever try to contact me, Clara, or anyone associated with my life, I will hand this folder to the authorities personally. You will spend the rest of your life in a federal prison cell, and the whole world will know that Eleanor Vance was nothing but a common thief." Julian stood up, his hands shaking. "Mom?" Is it true? Did you, did you steal that money for me? Eleanor didn't look at him. She couldn't. She just kept staring at me, realizing that the utilitarian man she had mocked for 30 years was the only person standing between her and a prison jumpsuit. Sign the renunciation, Eleanor, I said, pushing a pen across the table. Sign it, and take your son and your shame, and get out of my house. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. It was a small, dry sound, like a dead leaf blowing across a sidewalk. When she finished, she pushed the paper back to me with a trembling hand. She stood up, her movements stiff and clumsy, and walked toward the foyer without looking back. Julian followed her, his head bowed, looking like a man who had just realized he was a ghost in his own life. I watched them go. I stood by the window and watched the heavy European car pull away from the gravel driveway for the last time. The house felt lighter, the air suddenly easier to breathe. I walked back to the dining room and looked at the briefcase, still open on the table. It was empty now. The secrets were gone. I sat down in my chair, at the head of my table, and I let out a breath I had been holding for 12 years. I wasn't an ATM. I wasn't a utility. I was Arthur Vance, and I was finally alone in a house that belonged to me. The game was over. The cards were on the table. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about the foundation. It was solid. It was mine. There is a peculiar lightness that comes when you finally strip away the excess weight of a life you were never meant to carry. For decades, I thought my legacy was the accumulation of square footage, the prestige of a Greenwich address, and the comfort of a bank balance with enough zeros to drown out the noise of my own unhappiness. I thought I was building a fortress for a family that would outlast me. But all I was really doing was providing the timber for my own funeral pyre. Standing in the hollowed-out silence of my dining room after Eleanor and Julian slunk away, I realized that the things we own eventually own us if we aren't careful. The money wasn't a blessing. It was the bait that drew the predators to my door. I spent my life in the mud and the grit to earn a fortune that almost cost me my soul. But as I sat there looking at the empty chairs, I understood that a man's real worth isn't found in what he keeps, but in what he has the courage to give away. I spent my career making sure bridges wouldn't collapse under the weight of the world, and now, at 68, I finally had to do the same for my own life. I had to decide what was worth saving, and what needed to be let go, so that the structure could finally stand on its own. The house felt different that evening. The shadows were still long, and the dust motes still danced in the shafts of the setting sun, but the air was no longer thick with the stale scent of Eleanor's pretension. I sat at my desk in the study, the chocolate-brown briefcase open before me, its mission finally accomplished. Beside it sat a stack of legal documents that Clara had helped me finalize months ago, back when the pneumonia was still a fresh memory, and the resolve in my chest was as hard as tempered steel. I called my estate attorney, a man who had known me since I was a junior engineer, and I told him it was time. The living will of Arthur Vance was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a blueprint for a future where I was finally the architect of my own peace. Clara came over later that night. She didn't ask about the confrontation. She didn't need to. She just saw the signed renunciation papers on the foyer table and the way my shoulders had finally dropped from around my ears. She sat on the edge of my desk, swinging her feet, looking at the manila folders that represented the liquidation of 40 years of labor. "You're sure about this, Uncle Arthur?" she asked, her voice soft but not doubting. "It's a lot of history to let go of." "It's not history, Clara," I said, leaning back in my chair and looking at the photo of my parents on the cottage porch. "It's just stagnant capital." Eleanor was right about that, though she didn't realize she was the one making it rot. "I want to build something that actually helps someone cross over to a better life. Something that doesn't require a gala or a silk dress to matter." I picked up the final version of the Vance Legacy Trust. It was the result of 6 months of quiet, meticulous planning. I had decided to sell the Greenwich house, the tomb of marble and crystal, and every other asset Eleanor had once considered theirs. The proceeds, along with my personal retirement accounts and the remains of the bridge-building fortune, were being funneled into the Sam and Mary Vance Scholarship Fund. It was named after my parents, two people who never owned a diamond, but knew the value of a solid day's work. It was designed to provide full-ride tuition for students from working-class backgrounds who wanted to study civil engineering, kids like I had been, kids who were willing to get their boots muddy to build something real for their communities. Then there was the matter of the remaining estate. I looked at Clara, who had been my only bridge during the years of silence. I've set up a separate trust for you, Clara. It's not enough to make you a socialite, thank God, but it's enough to make sure you never have to worry about a roof over your head or a bribe from someone like Eleanor ever again. You kept my keys when I thought I'd lost them. It's only right you have a home of your own to keep them in. Clara started to protest, her eyes welling up, but I held up a hand. It's non-negotiable, honey. It's item number 30 in the binder, the only item that isn't a receipt of betrayal. But the part of the will that brought a grim, satisfied smile to my face was the specific bequests section. It was a masterpiece of legal finality. I had instructed my attorney to include 2 very specific checks, one for Eleanor Vance, one for Julian Sterling. Each check was for the exact amount of $1. Under Connecticut law, by leaving them a specific amount, I was acknowledging their existence while making it legally impossible for them to contest the will on the grounds of being forgotten heirs. It was a $1 insurance policy against their greed. It was the ultimate utilitarian move, a tiny metallic slap in the face that cost me almost nothing but protected everything I had left. They're going to hate it, Clara whispered, looking at the $1 line items. They'll hate the math, I agreed. Because for the first time in their lives, they're being forced to look at a number that accurately reflects their value to me. Eleanor wanted the Vance name. She can keep it, but she won't find a single cent attached to it. And Julian? He can take his $1 and see if Robert Sterling can turn it into a pivot. I felt a profound sense of closure as I signed the final page. I wasn't being bitter. I was being an engineer. I was clearing the site of the debris so that the new construction could begin. The cottage in the Berkshires, my parents' place, was the only piece of property I kept. It was exempted from the trust, held in my private name. That was where I was going. Back to the cedar and the wood smoke. Back to the place where the only bridges I had to worry about were the ones I built across the creek for the hell of it. That night, for the first time in 4 years, I slept without the digital recorder under my pillow. I didn't need to listen to Eleanor's garden whispers or Julian's lies. I didn't need to audit the silence. The ledger was closed. The assets were distributed. The utility had been decommissioned from the service of predators and recommissioned for the service of the future. As the sun rose over the Connecticut hills the next morning, I stood in the empty foyer of the Greenwich house. The movers would be coming next week to take the few things I wanted to keep to the cottage. I looked at the grand staircase, the place where Eleanor had once stood in her lavender gala dress, looking down at me with that curated, icy distance. I didn't feel the sting of it anymore. I just saw a flight of stairs that needed a new coat of varnish and a different kind of family to walk on them. I walked out the front door, pulled it shut, and heard the lock click. It was a solid, honest sound. I walked to my old truck, the one that still had a bit of Millfield mud on the tires, and I didn't look back at the $3 million tomb. I had my briefcase, my blueprints for the scholarship fund, and a $1 bill's worth of memories. It was the most profitable day of my life. I was 70 pounds lighter and infinitely richer, heading toward a house that didn't have a single marble floor but had a foundation that not even Eleanor Vance could shake. The Duke of Arthur Vance was signed, sealed, and delivered. And for the first time in 68 years, I was the only one who knew the combination to the vault. There is a specific kind of silence that greets you at the end of a long, arduous journey. Not the hollow, ringing silence of isolation I felt when Eleanor first walked out, but a soft, rhythmic quiet that feels like a long-awaited exhale. For decades, I lived my life by the laws of tension and compression, worrying about how much weight a single beam could carry before it buckled. I applied that same rigid engineering to my heart, thinking that if I just bore the weight of my family's disdain, I was fulfilling my duty as the foundation. But foundations aren't meant to be prisons, and love shouldn't feel like a structural failure you're constantly trying to patch with money. Sitting here on the porch of the cottage in the Berkshires, watching the first light of a Connecticut morning filter through the cedar trees, I finally understand that the greatest thing I ever built wasn't a bridge over a river. It was the exit ramp out of a life that was killing me. The Navy binder is closed. The Greenwich mansion is a ghost in my rearview mirror, and for the first time in 68 years, the only person I have to answer to is the man staring back at me in the reflection of my morning tea. The morning air here smells different than it did in Greenwich. There, it always smelled of manicured lawns and the sharp metallic tang of ambition. Here, it smells of damp earth, pine needles, and the wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. It's an honest smell. I was sitting on the porch swing, the chain creaking in a slow, familiar tempo, holding a mug of Earl Grey that Clara had brewed for me. She was sitting in the wicker chair opposite mine, her laptop finally closed, staring out at the creek that ran along the edge of the property. We hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, and for once, the silence didn't need to be filled with evidence or audits. "I heard from the attorney yesterday evening, Uncle Arthur," Clara said, her voice barely rising above the rustle of the leaves. "The Greenwich house closed. The buyers are a young couple. He's an architect, she's a pediatrician. They've already started asking about the original blueprints. They want to strip away the marble Eleanor put in and find the bones of the house again." I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Good. A house like that deserves people who want to see its bones, not just its jewelry. "And the other news?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Clara sighed, a small, sad sound. "It's all over the local papers. Eleanor's resignation from the Heritage Society was accepted with immediate effect. The donors are furious. Without the Vance estate to buffer her, the board didn't waste any time distancing themselves. She tried to move into that smaller apartment in the city, the one Julian was using, but it turns out the lease was in the company name, and the creditors seized the furniture 2 days ago. Last I heard, she's staying in a roadside motel near the New Jersey border, trying to get Robert Sterling to take her calls. "And Julian?" "Robert won't see him," Clara replied, looking at me with a mixture of pity and pride. "Once the investors saw the shell company records we released, the funding vanished. Julian is facing a series of civil suits for misrepresentation. He's looking for work, apparently. But it turns out that visionary CEO doesn't look very good on a resume when you don't have a father's bank account to back up the failures." I leaned my head back against the porch railing and closed my eyes. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the revenge people talk about in the movies. What I felt was a profound sense of equilibrium. I had spent 30 years being the utility for people who didn't value the power I provided. Now, the power was back in my own grid. Eleanor and Julian weren't victims of my cruelty. They were victims of the very reality they had spent years trying to ignore. They had built their lives on the assumption that the foundation would never stop providing, no matter how much they chipped away at it. They had finally learned that gravity eventually wins. "Do you hate them, Uncle Arthur?" Clara asked suddenly. I thought about it for a long minute. I thought about the hospital bed and the 5 days of silence. I thought about the birthday cards stamped with red ink and the watches Julian had pawned to buy a weekend of status. "No," I said, and I realized I meant it. "Hate is just another form of attachment, Clara. It's just another weight to carry. I don't hate them. I just don't have a seat for them at my table anymore. I've spent 68 years building things for other people. I think I'd like to spend the rest of my time building something for myself." I looked down at my hands. The calluses were still there, the skin still toughened by years of grit and labor, but they weren't shaking anymore. The tremor that had plagued me since the heart surgery had vanished the moment I handed Eleanor that $1 check. I stood up, the porch swing giving one last, long creak, and walked to the edge of the stairs. The Sam and Mary Vance Scholarship Fund was already receiving its first round of applications. Clara had shown me a few of the essays. There was one boy from a town in Pennsylvania, the son of a steelworker, who wrote about wanting to build bridges because he lived in a place where the old ones were falling apart, cutting off his community from the rest of the world. He talked about engineering as a form of service, a way to keep people connected. Reading his words felt like looking into a mirror across time. I was going to meet him next month. I was going to tell him that the most important part of any bridge isn't the steel you can see, but the integrity of the material you can't. I walked back inside the cottage. The navy binder was sitting on the small bookshelf in the living room, tucked between a book on Appalachian birds and an old collection of Sam's poetry. It was just a book now. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just a record of a bridge that failed. and the lessons I learned so I wouldn't build the next one the same way. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the one made of solid, unpainted oak. There were no lilies here, no crystal chandeliers, no governor's scotch, just the smell of toast and the sound of the creek. I was Arthur Vance. I was an engineer. And for the first time in my life, I knew that the structure I was standing on was sound. Not because of the money in the bank or the name on the door, but because the man inside was finally whole. If the story of Arthur Vance has made you reflect on the value of trust, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel to support us in producing more quality series like this. You can also watch similar stories right on the screen now. The image of Arthur sitting peacefully with his cup of tea on the Greenwich porch, after having closed the briefcase of hurt, is a testament to the fact that money can be lost, but honor and serenity are things no one can take away. The biggest lesson isn't revenge, but knowing when to stop to protect yourself. Thank you for listening.